He never spoke during rides, never asked where you were going, just drove through the city's dark streets like he knew every shadow, every shortcut, every story the night could tell. Until a young officer got in his cab and saw the faded photograph taped to his dashboard. And everything changed. Welcome to Dream Blaze. Before we begin this story of silent service and forgotten wings, tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from today? And if you believe stories like this deserve to be remembered, hit that subscribe button and help us honor those who served in ways we never knew. The taxi sat at the corner of 5th and Main every night at exactly 11:30 p.m. Same spot, same driver, same dented yellow Crown Victoria that had seen better decades. The paint was faded but clean. The interior smelled like coffee and old leather. And behind the wheel sat a man who had perfected the art of being invisible. His name was Frank. At least, that's what the license hanging from the rearview mirror said. Frank Morrison, taxi license 4471, valid through next December. But nobody ever called him Frank. Most passengers didn't call him anything at all. They just got in, mumbled an address, and watched the city blur past their windows while he navigated streets with the precision of someone who had mapped every inch of the darkness. He was maybe 60, maybe 70. Hard to tell. His hair had gone completely gray, swept back and kept short. His hands were weathered but steady on the wheel, and his eyes, when you caught them in the rearview mirror, held the kind of quiet that came from seeing too much and saying too little. Frank worked the night shift exclusively. From 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., 6 days a week, he drove through the underbelly of a city that most people only saw during daylight. He picked up nurses ending double shifts, bartenders counting tips, insomniacs with nowhere to go but away. He drove college students home from parties they'd regret, and businessmen to airports for flights that couldn't wait until morning, and he never, ever spoke unless spoken to first. Most passengers didn't mind. Night riders had their own reasons for preferring silence. Some were tired, some were drunk, some were running from things they couldn't name. Frank understood that. He had his own reasons for working when the rest of the world slept. The regulars knew his patterns. Mrs. Chen from the hospital called his dispatch number every Tuesday at 2:15 a.m. for a ride home from her cleaning job. She'd get in, say, Maple Street, and they'd drive 12 blocks without another word. At the end, she'd hand him exact change plus a $2 tip, and he'd nod once. That was their entire relationship. Perfect understanding built on mutual respect for silence. Jake from the all-night diner called him when the buses stopped running, always needed a ride to the east side, always smelled like French fries and exhaustion. He'd tried small talk exactly twice in 2 years. Frank's responses had been polite but brief. Yes? No. After that, Jake learned to appreciate the quiet. But it was the one-time fares that told Frank's real story. The way he handled drunk college kids with infinite patience, never judging, never lecturing, just getting them home safe. The way he waited an extra 2 minutes when someone was digging through their purse for money, never hurrying, never complaining. The way he took the long route around construction without charging extra, or found shortcuts that saved time when someone was clearly in distress. He drove like someone who understood that everyone in his back seat was trusting him with more than just transportation. They were trusting him with their vulnerability, their late-night confessions, their tears, their laughter, their silence. And Frank Morrison protected that trust like it was sacred. The photograph had been there so long that most passengers never noticed it. Taped to the lower corner of his dashboard, right where the windshield met the plastic, was a small black and white picture. Faded, creased at the edges, protected by a piece of clear tape that had yellowed with age. It showed 3 men in flight suits standing in front of what looked like a helicopter. They were young, maybe in their 20s, squinting against bright sunlight. Their names were written in pen across the bottom in handwriting that had faded, but never quite disappeared. Morrison, Chen, Rodriguez, Da Nang, 1971. The man on the left was clearly Frank, though 50 years younger. Same serious expression, same steady eyes, but with dark hair and a face that hadn't yet learned to carry decades of quiet. His flight suit bore the wings of a helicopter pilot, and on his chest was a patch that read "Dust Off," the call sign for medical evacuation helicopters. Most passengers never looked down at the dashboard. They stared out windows, at their phones, at anything but the silent man driving them through the night. But every so often, someone would notice. They'd glance down, squint at the old photograph, and something would shift in their expression. A few had asked about it over the years. "Is that you in the picture? Or were you in Vietnam?" Frank's answers were always the same, brief, polite, and followed by a change of subject. "Long time ago," he'd say, or "different life," and then he'd adjust the radio or ask if the temperature was comfortable. He never elaborated, never told the stories that the photograph represented, never mentioned the hundreds of wounded soldiers he'd carried out of landing zones under enemy fire, never talked about the 3 Purple Hearts in a shoebox at home or the medal he'd never worn since the day he'd taken off the uniform. The photograph was the only evidence of Frank Morrison's other life. The one where he'd been Lieutenant Frank Morrison, helicopter pilot, 571 Medical Detachment. The one where his voice had been the last thing some men heard before they died, and the first thing others heard when they realized they were going to live. But that was a long time ago. Now he was just Frank the taxi driver, and that was exactly how he preferred it. Until the night Officer Marcus Webb got into his cab. It was 3:17 a.m. on a Tuesday in October when Marcus Webb flagged down Frank's taxi outside the Veterans Hospital. Marcus was young, maybe 25, wearing his army dress uniform with the crisp precision of someone who took pride in his service. He'd been visiting his grandfather, a Korean War veteran who'd been admitted with pneumonia. Marcus slid into the back seat with the careful movements of someone who'd been on duty for too long. He gave Frank an address across town and settled back, exhausted. "Rough night?" Frank asked, breaking his usual silence. He didn't know why he'd spoken first. Something about the young soldier's posture, maybe, or the way he carried himself despite his fatigue. "Yeah," Marcus replied, surprised to hear the driver speak. "Been at the hospital since yesterday. My grandfather. He's not doing great." Frank nodded once in the rearview mirror and pulled away from the curb. They drove in comfortable silence for a few blocks, winding through empty streets that glistened with recent rain. Marcus found himself studying the driver in the mirror. There was something familiar about him, something that nagged at the edges of recognition. The way he held his shoulders, maybe, or the careful precision with which he navigated the streets. As they stopped at a red light, Marcus's eyes wandered to the dashboard, and that's when he saw it. The faded photograph, barely visible in the green glow of the traffic light. Marcus leaned forward slightly, squinting at the image. 3 men in flight suits, military aircraft, Vietnam era by the look of it, and the man on the left. Marcus's breath caught in his throat. He looked up at Frank's reflection in the mirror, then back at the photograph, then up again. "Sir," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying a new weight of respect, "is that you in that picture?" Frank met his eyes in the mirror. For a moment, neither man spoke. The light turned green, and Frank drove forward, but something had shifted in the cab's atmosphere. "Long time ago," Frank said finally, his usual deflection. But Marcus wasn't deterred. He was a military man himself, and he recognized what he was seeing. The patch on the flight suit, the aircraft in the background, the way the 3 men stood with the easy camaraderie of brothers in arms. "Dust off," Marcus said, reading the patch in the photograph. "You were a medevac pilot." Frank's hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel, but he didn't respond. Marcus sat back, his mind racing. He'd grown up hearing stories about Vietnam, about the helicopter pilots who flew into hell to save the wounded. His own grandfather had talked about them with a reverence reserved for saints and heroes. My grandfather was infantry, Marcus said softly. 101st Airborne. He told me once that medevac pilots were the bravest men he'd ever seen, said they'd fly into anything to get wounded soldiers out. Frank remained silent, but Marcus could see his jaw working in the mirror. He said one pilot saved his life near Da Nang in '71. Came in under heavy fire, took shrapnel in the cockpit, but still got him and 5 other guys out. Marcus paused, looking at the photograph again. Da Nang, 1971. The taxi had reached Marcus's apartment building, but Frank didn't stop. He drove past the address and pulled into an empty parking lot a block away. He put the car in park and turned around to face his passenger for the first time. Frank Morrison looked at the young officer in his back seat and saw something he hadn't expected. Not curiosity, not pity, but understanding. "What was your grandfather's name?" Frank asked quietly. "David Webb," Marcus replied. "Sergeant David Webb." Frank was quiet for a long moment, studying Marcus's face in the dim light of the parking lot. When he spoke, his voice was softer than Marcus had heard it all night. "I remember him," Frank said. "Webb. He was hit in the leg, right? Shrapnel from a mortar round. Kept apologizing for bleeding on my helicopter." Marcus's eyes widened. "That was you," Frank nodded slowly. "He was a good soldier." Kept talking about his grandson back home who wanted to be in the army when he grew up. He paused. "I guess that's you." The 2 men sat in silence, separated by decades and generations, but connected by a single moment of shared history. Marcus felt like he was looking at a ghost, a legend made flesh and blood and taxi license. "Why don't you tell people?" Marcus asked finally. "What you did over there?" Frank turned back around and put the car in drive. "Because it wasn't about me," he said simply. "It was about getting them home." He drove Marcus to his apartment building and parked at the curb. Marcus reached for his wallet, but Frank waved him off. "No charge," Frank said. "Tell your grandfather Frank Morrison says hello, and that his grandson turned out just fine." Marcus got out of the cab but leaned down to the driver's window before Frank could pull away. "Thank you," Marcus said, "for everything, then and now." Frank nodded once, the same brief acknowledgement he gave all his passengers. But as he drove away, Marcus could swear he saw him straighten up a little behind the wheel, as if something heavy had been lifted from his shoulders. Marcus went to the hospital the next morning and found his grandfather sitting up in bed, looking stronger than he had in days. "Grandpa," Marcus said, pulling up a chair, "I met someone last night I think you'd want to know about." David Webb listened as his grandson told him about the taxi driver with the photograph, the quiet man who remembered a scared 19-year-old soldier bleeding in the back of a helicopter over 50 years ago. When Marcus finished, the old man was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the city beyond. "Frank Morrison," he said finally, tasting the name like something precious. "I never knew his name. They just called him Dustoff 27 over the radio." He looked at his grandson. "You know, I wrote a letter to the Army after the war, trying to find out who that pilot was so I could thank him. They said the records were classified." "Well," Marcus said, "now you know where to find him." That evening, David Webb insisted on being discharged from the hospital early. Against the protests of his doctors and his grandson, he dressed in his old Army jacket, the one with his unit patch and service ribbons, and had Marcus drive him to 5th and Main. They arrived at 11:25 p.m. and waited. At exactly 11:30, a yellow Crown Victoria pulled up to the corner and parked. David Webb got out of Marcus's car slowly, his age and illness making each step deliberate. He walked to the taxi and tapped on the driver's window. Frank looked up, confused, until he saw the old man's face. Recognition dawned slowly, followed by something that might have been wonder. Frank rolled down the window, and the 2 men looked at each other across 5 decades of silence. "Sergeant Webb," Frank said quietly. "Lieutenant Morrison," David replied. "I believe I owe you a thank you." Frank got out of the cab and stood facing the man he'd pulled from a jungle landing zone when they were both young and far from home. They were old now, marked by time and weather and the weight of years, but in that moment they were also exactly who they'd been in 1971, two soldiers who'd kept faith with each other. David Webb saluted, crisp and formal, despite his age. Frank Morrison hesitated for only a second before returning the salute with the precision of a man who'd never forgotten how. Then, David Webb stepped forward and embraced the pilot who'd saved his life, and Frank Morrison, who hadn't spoken unnecessarily to a passenger in 20 years, found himself with more words than he'd used in decades. They talked until dawn. About the war, about the men they'd served with, about the ones who hadn't made it home, about the photograph on Frank's dashboard and the letter David had written to the Army, about grandsons and taxi fares and the strange ways that life brings people back together when they need it most. When the sun came up, Frank was no longer just the silent taxi driver who worked the night shift. He was Lieutenant Frank Morrison again, helicopter pilot, lifesaver, brother in arms. And for the first time in 20 years, he didn't mind being seen. Word spread quietly through the veteran community after that, not like gossip or rumors, but like recognition passing from one old soldier to another. The taxi driver on the night shift wasn't just Frank Morrison anymore. He was Dustoff 27, the pilot who'd flown into hell and back to bring their brothers home. It started small. A few more passengers recognized the photograph on his dashboard. Someone who'd served in Vietnam, someone whose father had been saved by a medevac crew, someone who understood what those faded wings represented. Frank found himself having conversations he hadn't had in decades, brief ones, respectful ones, but conversations nonetheless, about service and sacrifice, about the men who didn't make it home, about the strange peace that came from driving through quiet streets when the rest of the world slept. He still worked the night shift, still drove the same routes, picked up the same regulars, maintained the same professional silence with passengers who didn't need to know his story. But now there was something different in his eyes when he looked in the rearview mirror. Something that hadn't been there before Marcus Webb had gotten in his cab and seen past the taxi license to the man behind the wheel. One night, a young Marine fresh back from Afghanistan got in his cab outside a bar downtown. The kid was drunk, emotional, struggling with things he couldn't name. "I don't know how to do this," the Marine said, tears in his voice. "How to be normal again, how to live with what I've seen." Frank met his eyes in the mirror and saw himself 50 years ago, young, broken, trying to figure out how to carry the weight of war in a world that had moved on without him. "One night at a time," Frank said quietly. "One fare at a time. You find ways to serve that don't hurt so much." The Marine looked up, hearing something in the driver's voice that he recognized. "Were you?" Frank nodded toward the dashboard where the photograph still sat taped to the same corner where it had been for 20 years. The Marine leaned forward and studied the image. When he sat back, his expression had changed. "Thank you," he said simply. Frank drove him home in comfortable silence, the kind that came from understanding. When they arrived, Frank turned around and handed him a piece of paper with a phone number written on it. "That's the VFW post," Frank said. "Good guys. They'll understand what you're going through." The Marine took the paper and held Frank's eyes for a moment. "Will you be there?" Frank considered the question. He hadn't been to a VFW meeting in 30 years, hadn't wanted the attention, the questions, the weight of his own stories. But looking at this young man, this fellow warrior who was struggling to find his place in a world that had continued spinning while he was at war, Frank realized that maybe silence wasn't the only way to serve anymore. "Yeah," Frank said, "I'll be there." Frank Morrison still drives the night shift, still picks up the same routes, still maintains the same quiet professionalism that has made him the most trusted taxi driver in the city. But now, twice a month, he can be found at the VFW post on Oak Street, sitting in a circle of old warriors and young veterans, sharing stories that matter and listening to others who need to be heard. The photograph is still taped to his dashboard, still faded, still protected by yellowed tape, still showing 3 young men in flight suits who were willing to fly into anything to bring their brothers home. But now, sometimes, passengers ask about it. And sometimes, when the moment is right and the passenger needs to hear it, Frank Morrison tells them about Lieutenant Frank Morrison and the helicopter that saved lives in a war that ended 50 years ago, but never really leaves you. He's learned that some stories aren't meant to be buried in silence. Some stories are meant to be shared, one passenger at a time, one night at a time, one life at a time. Because sometimes the best way to honor the past is to let it help heal the present. And sometimes the most important journey isn't from point A to point B, but from silence to understanding, from isolation to connection, from the weight of what you've carried alone to the peace that comes from sharing it with someone who needs to know that they're not alone either. Frank Morrison drives through the dark streets of a sleeping city, carrying more than just passengers from place to place. He carries hope. He carries understanding. He carries the quiet knowledge that service doesn't end when you take off the uniform. It just finds new ways to save lives, one fare at a time. So I ask you now, have you ever met someone like Frank Morrison? Someone who served in silence, who carried their stories like sacred trusts, who found ways to keep helping long after the world stopped noticing their sacrifice? Share their name in the comments. Tell us how they touched your life. Because at The Human Stories, we believe that every veteran story matters, even the ones told in whispers during late-night cab rides. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to remember that heroes come in all forms, sometimes even with a taxi license and 20 years of silence. Subscribe to Dream Blaze and help us honor those who served in ways we're only just beginning to understand. We'll see you in the next story. And remember, next time you're in a taxi late at night, take a moment to really look at the person behind the wheel. You might be sitting behind a legend,